He wed two of his 16-year-old nieces, becoming the most unsettling patriarch in West Virginia's history. Hidden within the secluded hollows of Appalachia, far from the gaze of modern society, lie dark tales of families lost to time, buried like secrets the world is afraid to uncover. This is the tale of Elijah Blackwood, a man whose heritage of distortion and dominance turned generations of his own family into casualties of their tainted lineage. In the rough terrain of West Virginia, from 1927 to 1978, one of the most troubling family dynasties the area had ever known took root. Elijah Blackwood, born in 1897 in a remote McDowell County valley, was raised in a separate reality where seclusion dictated not just survival, but the very bonds between the handful of families living there. The Appalachian Mountains have long been recognized for sheltering insulated communities. In the early 1900s, many of these groups existed with virtually no interaction with the wider world. Roads were rough or non-existent, and families could rely only on each other to live. Within this environment of severe isolation, marital customs considered taboo elsewhere sometimes became an unspoken norm. Elijah was the firstborn of 8 children. His father, Thomas Blackwood, was known throughout the area for his domineering nature and the harsh discipline he used on his children. Elijah's mother, Sarah, was the second cousin of Thomas, a setup not unusual in those cut-off communities of the era. The family survived on subsistence farming and hunting, almost never venturing down to the bigger towns in the valley. When Elijah reached 18 in 1915, his father sent him to labor in the region's newly emerging coal mines. This was his initial genuine exposure to a world beyond the isolated valley of his upbringing. There, among the miners, Elijah encountered different individuals and concepts, but he also cultivated a sense of supremacy over outsiders. He was convinced his family line was superior and that people from beyond the mountains were lesser. In 1918, after 3 years in the mines, Elijah returned to the valley following an accident that left a permanent scar across his face. His seclusion after the injury only amplified his controlling nature. When his father died in 1923, Elijah, then 26, took on the position of family patriarch. It was during this time that Elijah's conduct started to show alarming indicators. He wielded total authority over his younger siblings, particularly his sisters Margaret and Eleanor. In 1925, he organized the marriage of Margaret, then 22, to Jeremiah Tucker, a man 15 years her senior, from a neighboring property. Elijah's stipulation for the marriage was that the pair would continue to live on Blackwood land under his watch. The next year, 1926, Eleanor was also compelled to marry, this time to a distant cousin, Robert Harris. Once again, Elijah demanded the couple reside under his roof, thus beginning the formation of what would later be called the Blackwood Compound, a small gathering of cabins where Elijah kept the entire family under his rule. Between 1927 and 1930, Margaret had 3 daughters, Ruth, Hannah, and Abigail. Eleanor, in turn, had 2 daughters, Esther and Mary. Elijah displayed an unnerving interest in his nieces, constantly meddling in their upbringing and enforcing rigid rules for their education. At that time, the geographical seclusion of communities like the Blackwoods meant there was little to no outside oversight. Schools were too far away for regular attendance, and authorities seldom visited these remote areas. This isolation enabled Elijah to solidify his power over the family without external challenge. As the girls grew older, Elijah increasingly limited their exposure to the outside world. They did not go to school and were taught at home, primarily by their mothers and by Elijah himself, who instructed them in a twisted version of family history and the virtues of keeping their bloodline pure. It was in 1943, when Ruth and Esther turned 16, that Elijah's truly alarming behavior was revealed. That year, his sisters' husbands, Jeremiah and Robert, died under questionable circumstances, Jeremiah in a hunting accident and Robert from a sudden illness. While there were no formal investigations then due to the isolation, later accounts from younger relatives would imply the deaths were orchestrated by Elijah. With his sisters widowed and entirely dependent on him, Elijah announced he would marry Ruth, his niece and Margaret's daughter. The wedding happened in a private ceremony at the compound itself. With no official record or presence of recognized religious figures, Margaret, dominated by her brother for years and fearing for her own safety, could not object. Merely 3 months later, in an even more shocking act, Elijah declared he would also marry Esther, Eleanor's daughter, his other 16-year-old niece. This second union occurred in the same clandestine way as the first. Understanding the historical context is key. In the 1940s, while marriages between close relatives were illegal in West Virginia, authorities hardly monitored isolated communities. The state had banned uncle-niece marriages since its founding. But in remote regions where civil records were rarely kept, such laws were ineffective. In the following years, Ruth bore 4 of Elijah's children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Esther had 3 children, 1 boy and 2 girls. It was in this first generation from these incestuous relationships that the genetic consequences of consanguinity started to become clearly visible. Of the 7 children born from these unions, 5 had major health issues. 3 had obvious physical deformities, including fused fingers, syndactyly, spinal problems, and facial malformations. 2 others displayed what was then called mental disability, now understood as significant intellectual disability. In the 1950s, the seclusion of the Blackwood compound started to slowly erode as road construction expanded into the region. In 1952, a traveling doctor who visited remote communities to provide basic healthcare came across the Blackwood family. Horrified by the conditions he saw, especially the state of the children, he tried to notify the authorities. However, at that time, government involvement in family affairs was far more restricted than today. Furthermore, mountain families were known for their suspicion of outsiders and officials. When county officials finally visited the compound, Elijah produced fake documents claiming Ruth and Esther were actually his wives from unrelated families in nearby communities. The women, terrified by years of abuse and manipulation, confirmed his story. The initial inquiry was closed, but the case attracted the attention of Dr. Charles Montgomery, a physician with a growing interest in the new field of genetics. In 1954, Dr. Montgomery managed to get permission to examine some of the compound's children, supposedly as part of a rural health program. In his notes, which would only be found decades later, Montgomery meticulously recorded the health problems he observed in the Blackwood children. He noted the high rate of congenital defects and rightly suspected they were the outcome of close inbreeding. At that time, although genetic knowledge was still limited compared to now, it was already well known that consanguineous relationships raised the risk of recessive disorders. Montgomery wrote, "The anomaly patterns seen in the Blackwood children align with what scientific literature describes as resulting from close consanguinity. The occurrence of physical malformations and cognitive impairment is markedly higher than expected in a general population. It is alarming to consider the conditions that led to such a situation in this isolated family." Despite his suspicions, Montgomery faced opposition from both the family and local authorities. In rural Appalachian communities of the 1950s, family matters were considered private, and there was a cultural resistance to interference, even with evidence of abuse or illegal activity. Meanwhile, inside the compound, the situation worsened. Between 1955 and 1960, 5 more children were born from Elijah's relationships with his nieces. Of these, 3 died before their first birthday, suffering from multiple health complications. Infant mortality was not uncommon in poor rural areas then, so it didn't immediately raise alarms. A pivotal moment came in 1962 when Hannah, Margaret's second daughter and Ruth's sister, managed to escape the compound at age 33. Having lived her whole life under Elijah's tyrannical rule, Hannah finally found the courage to flee. After witnessing years of abuse, she undertook a difficult 3-day journey through the mountains to the town of Welsh, where she told her story to local authorities. At first, her account was met with doubt. Hannah, having lived in isolation all her life, had trouble communicating and little knowledge of the world outside the compound. Additionally, her accusations were so severe that many local officials thought them imaginary or overstated. It was only when Thomas Ricks, a young social worker new to the county social services department, decided to look into the case more carefully that authorities started to take the claims seriously. Ricks, unbound by old influence networks and the silent codes of small rural towns, was determined to find the truth. In October 1962, Ricks arranged an official visit to the Blackwood compound, accompanied by 2 state police officers. What they discovered was deeply troubling. The compound had expanded to include 6 main structures housing about 30 people, all under the control of Elijah, then 65. The living conditions were dreadful. The children, many with clear health problems and disabilities, lived in extreme poverty and neglect. Some of the teenagers and young adults, children of Elijah with Ruth and Esther, showed obvious signs of consanguinity, including distinctive facial features like receding jaws, prominent foreheads, and closely set eyes. Even more alarming, Ricks found evidence that Elijah had started relationships with some of his own daughters, his grandnieces, continuing the cycle of abuse and incest. Confronted with the evidence, the authorities finally acted. Elijah was arrested, along with 2 of his older sons who had become his accomplices in controlling the family. The women and children were removed from the compound and taken for medical and psychological assessment. The subsequent court case in 1963 was unprecedented for the time and region. Elijah faced multiple charges, including child abuse, illegal confinement, and incest. During the trial, held behind closed doors due to the sensitive accusations, disturbing details emerged about how Elijah had maintained control over the family. For decades, he had built an almost religious belief system, persuading family members that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous, and that only by obeying his rules could they stay pure and safe. Physical isolation mixed with psychological manipulation had let his reign of terror persist for generations. Medical experts testifying at the trial presented evidence of the physical and psychological impacts of prolonged incest in the family. Dr. William Patterson, a geneticist from the University of Virginia who examined several children, told the court, "What we see in the younger Blackwood family members is consistent with the phenomenon known as inbreeding depression, the manifestation of harmful recessive genetic traits due to breeding between closely related individuals." Patterson continued, "In normal populations, harmful recessive genes rarely cause issues because a person usually has one defective copy, balanced by a healthy copy from the other parent. However, when close relatives have children, the chance of a child inheriting 2 copies of the same harmful recessive gene rises dramatically." The evidence included high infant mortality rates among Elijah's descendants, approximately 40%, versus a then national average of about 2%, a significantly raised incidence of congenital malformations, including heart defects, cleft palate, and skeletal abnormalities, widespread intellectual disability, with nearly 70% of living children showing some degree of cognitive impairment, severe immunological problems making children highly susceptible to infections, and reduced height and delayed physical development in almost all descendants. A particularly disturbing aspect revealed during the trial was the so-called founder effect in the Blackwood line. This genetic phenomenon occurs when a new population is founded by a very small number of individuals from a larger population, leading to reduced genetic diversity. In the Blackwoods case, with generations of consanguineous marriages, certain rare recessive traits had become common in the family. A notable example was a rare form of polydactyly, extra fingers, combined with syndactyly, fused fingers, creating a distinctive hand malformation affecting almost 30% of the children born in the compound. Elijah Blackwood was convicted on all charges in December 1963 and sentenced to life in prison. He died in Moundsville State Prison in 1978 at age 81, apparently never expressing remorse for his actions. The fate of the victims varied. The adult women, including Ruth and Esther, then 36, faced huge challenges adapting to life outside the compound. Having been subjugated and manipulated their entire lives, many struggled with mental health issues, including what would now be diagnosed as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The younger children were placed in foster homes or, in the most severe cases of disability, in specialized care institutions. Follow-up records show that even those without obvious physical deformities often developed health problems related to consanguinity later in life, including reduced fertility, autoimmune diseases, and rare metabolic disorders. In 1970, 7 years after the trial, a longitudinal study was started by West Virginia University to track the survivors of the Blackwood family. This study, which continued until 1985, provided some of the first systematic data on the long-term effects of prolonged consanguinity in a human population. Among the most significant findings was the persistence of genetic issues, even in individuals who seemed physically normal. Many survivors without visible anomalies still carried multiple recessive genetic mutations that could affect their own children if they married people who, by chance, carried the same recessive genes. The study also documented the surprisingly high prevalence of certain rare disorders among Blackwood descendants. For instance, Usher syndrome type 2, a genetic condition causing deafness and progressive blindness, was found in 8 family members, a rate hundreds of times higher than in the general population. Another revealing aspect was the pattern of neurological development. Even children without significant intellectual disability often showed atypical cognitive development patterns, including specific difficulties with abstract reasoning, spatial processing, and executive functions. These findings contributed to the growing understanding of the complexity of neurological development and its genetic basis. The legacy of the Blackwood case extends beyond the direct impact on the family. It had a lasting effect on child protection policies in West Virginia and other states. The case was repeatedly cited during the 1970s in legislative debates about the need to strengthen child protection laws and intervention mechanisms for abusive families. In 1974, when the U.S. Congress passed the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, creating the first federal program specifically for child protection, the Blackwood case was mentioned as an extreme example of how isolation and a lack of outside supervision can allow abuse to continue for generations. From a scientific perspective, the case offered valuable data for the emerging field of behavioral genetics. While research ethics today forbid similar studies, the data gathered from the Blackwood survivors, always with proper consent, helped clarify the complex interaction between genetics and environment in human development. For example, among the Blackwood siblings raised in different foster homes, those who received early and intensive educational intervention often greatly surpassed initial expectations based on their genetic profile, showing the significant influence of environment on development, even with strong genetic predispositions. A less discussed aspect of the case is its impact on Appalachian communities themselves. For decades, the Blackwood story was used sensationally by the media to reinforce negative stereotypes about mountain people as inbred hillbillies. This unfair portrayal hid the complex social and economic realities of the region. In fact, later demographic studies showed that rates of consanguineous marriage in Appalachia were not significantly different from other rural American regions during the same historical period. What made the Blackwood case exceptional was not the cultural context, but the extreme and deliberate nature of the abuse carried out by a deeply disturbed individual. In 1982, a PBS documentary titled The Children of the Shadows revisited the case, interviewing some of the adult survivors who agreed to share their stories. The documentary was groundbreaking for its sensitive handling of such a delicate subject and for giving a voice to the victims themselves. One of the most powerful interviewees was Sarah, daughter of Ruth and Elijah, who was 12 when the compound was discovered. At 31, Sarah had overcome tremendous adversity. Despite being born with a spinal malformation that limited her mobility and facing significant learning challenges, she had finished high school and become an advocate for disability rights. In the documentary, Sarah reflected, "People often ask me if I hate my father. The truth is, I barely remember him as a person. He was more like a dark force hanging over all of us. What I really feel is sadness. Sadness for what could have been. Sadness for the lives that were ruined before they even began." Another survivor interviewed was Michael, son of Esther and Elijah, who was 8 when he was rescued. Unlike many of his siblings and cousins, Michael had no serious physical abnormalities. Though he suffered from a rare blood disease requiring continuous treatment, he spoke openly about the challenges of building a normal identity after growing up in such extraordinary circumstances. "For years, I told no one about my past. I was ashamed, as if it was somehow my fault. It was only when I started seeing a therapist in college that I understood I was a victim, not someone who should feel shame. Understanding the science behind what happened to our family also helped. Knowing our health problems have a rational explanation, not some curse, like Elijah made us believe." The psychological impact on the survivors was as profound as the physical consequences. Many struggled with identity, self-esteem, and forming healthy relationships. Those who eventually had their own children often described intense anxiety about their children's health, even when marrying genetically unrelated partners. Emily, one of the few daughters of Elijah who built a relatively normal life and had her own family, described in the documentary the terror she felt during her pregnancy. "Every prenatal exam was torture. I was sure something would be wrong, that my father's sins would be visited on my innocent child. When my daughter was born perfectly healthy, I couldn't stop crying with relief." The Blackwood story also raised important questions about how societies handle survivors of extreme trauma. In the years right after the compound's discovery, the institutional response was fragmented and often inadequate. Many children were separated not only from their abusive parents but also from siblings and other relatives who could have provided a sense of continuity and connection. This separation, though well-intentioned, often added more trauma to already shattered lives. It was only in the 1970s, with the development of more holistic approaches to caring for traumatized children, that social services began recognizing the importance of preserving sibling bonds and providing specialized therapy for victims of family abuse. In 1978, the same year Elijah died in prison, a group of adult Blackwood survivors formed an informal support group that later became the New Roots Foundation. This non-profit, still active today, works to educate the public about child abuse and consanguinity and provides support to individuals born in similar situations. A particularly notable part of the Foundation's work is with medical and social service communities to raise awareness about the specific health needs of people with a history of family consanguinity. They have created educational materials to help health professionals identify rare conditions more common in this population, allowing for earlier, more effective interventions. In 1985, Dr. Robert Jenkins, a geneticist who worked extensively with the Blackwood survivors, published an influential study in the Journal of Medical Genetics that helped clarify specific mechanisms by which prolonged consanguinity affects human health. The study identified over 30 rare genetic conditions in the Blackwood family, many virtually unknown in the general population. Jenkins noted, "What makes the Blackwood case scientifically significant is not just the extent of consanguinity, but its directed nature over multiple generations. Unlike isolated communities where cousin marriages happen out of demographic necessity, here there was deliberate selection for extremely close relationships, creating a tragically revealing natural experiment on the effects of human inbreeding." Among the most surprising discoveries was identifying a previously unknown genetic variant affecting vitamin D metabolism, contributing to the high rates of rickets and other skeletal deformities in Blackwood children. This discovery later led to advances in treating certain rare forms of vitamin D-resistant rickets. As the 1980s progressed and younger survivors reached adulthood, new challenges appeared. Many faced difficult choices about having their own children, given their complex genetic history. Some chose not to have biological children, while others sought extensive genetic counseling and prenatal testing, a medical area then in its infancy. In 1992, nearly 30 years after the compound's discovery, a remarkable reunion took place. 17 adult Blackwood survivors, many of whom hadn't seen each other since childhood, gathered in Charleston, West Virginia, to share their stories and celebrate their recovery journeys. The event, organized by the New Roots Foundation, was closed to the public and media, providing a safe space for Reconnect Ion and healing. One participant, who chose to remain anonymous, later described the experience. "It was like finding pieces of a puzzle I didn't know were missing. Looking at people who shared not just my blood but my experiences, it was overwhelming but incredibly healing. For the first time, I was in a room where everyone truly understood." The legacy of the Blackwood case continues to resonate across multiple fields. In medical genetics, data collected over decades of tracking survivors contributed to our understanding of how recessive genes interact and express themselves. In child protection services, the case remains a powerful lesson on the dangers of extreme isolation and the need for community vigilance. For the people of Appalachia, the story is a reminder of the resilience required to overcome not just poverty and geographic isolation, but also the burden of negative stereotypes long affecting the region. Perhaps the most important legacy, however, comes from the survivors themselves. Many transformed their traumatic experiences into strength to help others. Some became social workers, nurses, teachers, and advocates, using their first-hand knowledge of trauma and recovery to make positive change. As Rebecca, one of Elijah's granddaughters who became a child psychologist, expressed, "For a long time, our family was defined by the darkness my grandfather created. But that's not our whole story. We are also defined by our survival, by our refusal to let the past dictate our future. Every time I use my experience to help a traumatized child find hope, I feel I'm rewriting a bit of that history." In 1998, when the last formal follow-up study of the Blackwood survivors was completed, researchers noted something remarkable. Despite tremendous genetic and psychological adversity, a surprising proportion of survivors had managed to build stable, and in many cases, extraordinary lives. This unexpected resilience challenged many initial assumptions about the prognosis for children born in such extreme circumstances. The final report concluded, "Perhaps the most important lesson from the Blackwood case is not about the consequences of consanguinity, but about the remarkable capacity of the human spirit to transcend even the most traumatic origins when given adequate support and opportunity." The case of Elijah Blackwood remains one of the most disturbing documented examples of family abuse and manipulation in the United States. It is a dark tale of how isolation, combined with a domineering individual, can create generations of suffering. But it is also, ultimately, a story about the possibility of healing and redemption, even in the unlikeliest of circumstances. In the words of one survivor, Elijah thought he was building a dynasty that would last forever, with him as the supreme ruler. Instead, his legacy is to serve as a warning to the world about the dangers of unchecked power and unsupervised isolation. If anything positive came from this horror, it's the determination of so many of us to make sure nothing like it ever happens again. Today, the mountains of West Virginia are very different from Elijah Blackwood's time. Roads reach the most remote hollows. The internet connects even the most secluded communities to the outside world, and child protection systems are far more vigilant. Yet, the Blackwood story remains a powerful reminder that the most terrible abuses can happen not just in city dark alleys, but also under the open mountain sky, where silence and isolation can conceal the most disturbing human truths.